42. That is how many days passed between the moment George Patton stood up in front of a room of British women he did not think reporters were allowed into, and told them it was the evident destiny of the British and Americans, and, he added almost as an afterthought, the Russians, to rule the world, and the moment his own Third Army was supposed to help decide the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. For a good part of those 42 days, Dwight Eisenhower was seriously deciding whether Patton would even still have a command by the time the invasion happened. We're going to tell you everything about what happened in those 42 days today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with the incident that came before this one, because Patton was not starting from a clean record when he opened his mouth in April 1944. This was not supposed to be a second chance at all. 9 months earlier, in Sicily, in the first week of August 1943, Patton had slapped 2 American soldiers under his command inside 2 separate evacuation hospitals. Both men, Private Charles Cool on August 3rd and Private Paul Bennett on August 10th, were being treated for what the Army at the time called battle fatigue, men who had broken down under sustained combat stress with no visible wound to show for it. Patton did not believe in the diagnosis. With Bennett, witnesses recorded him reaching for one of his ivory-handled pistols and telling the shaking soldier he ought to shoot him himself, calling him a goddamned whimpering coward, ordering him to shut up his goddamned crying because he would not have brave men who had actually been shot at watching a yellow bastard sit there in tears. He told Bennett he was going back to the front lines, that he might get shot and killed there, but that he was going to fight, and that if he refused, Patton would personally stand him against a wall and have a firing squad finish the job instead. He struck both men, in front of medical staff and other patients, hard enough and publicly enough that word reached Eisenhower's headquarters within days, regardless of any attempt to keep it quiet. Doctors and nurses who witnessed the Bennett incident were shaken enough by it that at least one wrote a formal account of what she had seen almost immediately afterward, on her own initiative, without being asked to by anyone above her. Word of that kind does not stay contained inside a single hospital tent for long, whatever rank the man doing the striking happens to hold. Eisenhower chose not to open a formal investigation, but the private letter he sent Patton afterward did not read like a man letting the matter go. He wrote that there could be no excuse for abuse of the sick or a display of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates, and that conduct of that kind would not be tolerated in his theater, no matter who the offender happened to be. He ordered Patton to personally apologize to both soldiers, and, a few days later, extended that order to cover every division in his own army. Patton spent the following weeks touring hospitals and formations across 7th Army, offering what witnesses at the time described as a muted, uncomfortable version of regret to men he had commanded into some of the hardest fighting of the war so far. Cool himself, brought into Patton's office for a private apology later that August, shook the general's hand afterward, and told people for years that he still considered Patton a great general, adding that, at the time, nobody around him had understood how sick he actually was. Cool went on to land at Normandy with the 26th Infantry before eventually returning home to Indiana. Bennett recovered enough within a week to return to his unit at the front, and later served a full career in the Army spanning Korea as well, retiring after 30 years of service. Neither man's later life reads like a story shaped primarily by the slap itself, which made the version of Patton splashed across American newspapers that November feel, to the men who had actually lived the moment, considerably smaller than the scandal it became. For 3 months that arrangement held. The story stayed inside the theater, known to the men who had witnessed it, and to the small circle of officers managing it, and did not reach the American public. That changed on the evening of November 21st, 1943, when the newspaper columnist Drew Pearson opened his regular Sunday radio broadcast on the Blue Network with the news that Lieutenant General George Patton had struck a hospitalized soldier in Sicily and had been severely reprimanded for it by Eisenhower himself. The reaction split almost immediately along predictable lines. Part of the American public and press furious that a general had struck a sick soldier, another part just as loudly defending Patton as a fighting man, being punished for exactly the kind of toughness that won battles. Congress debated it. Newspaper editorials argued both sides of it for weeks. Patton kept his command, in large part because Eisenhower and Marshall both judged his battlefield record too valuable to discard over it. But the cost was real and specific. When the ground force command structure for the invasion of France was finalized, the job of leading the American Army Group went to Omar Bradley, an officer junior to Patton in both rank and combat reputation, while Patton himself was left waiting for an assignment that, for months, did not come. It finally came in January 1944, when Patton was given command of the 3rd United States Army, still forming and training in England, not yet committed to combat, and not yet publicly announced as his. The assignment came with an additional, stranger condition attached to it. Allied deception planners were simultaneously using Patton's own name and reputation as the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude South, a sustained effort to convince German intelligence that the main invasion of France would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, delivered by an entirely fictional force called the 1st United States Army Group, 11 divisions, and roughly 150,000 men that existed only on paper, in fake radio traffic, and in dummy camps built across the fields of Kent and Essex. The deception planners filled those camps with inflatable rubber tanks and landing craft welded together from scaffolding tube and empty fuel drums, visible enough from the air to read as real to German reconnaissance photographs, but light enough for a handful of engineers to move and rearrange to simulate entire divisions shifting position. Patton was chosen specifically to command this phantom army because German intelligence rated him, correctly, as the Allied field commander their own officers feared most, and Patton was sent personally to tour the dummy installations with army photographers in tow, giving the entire fiction a face German intelligence would recognize and believe. It worked well past the invasion itself. Convinced Patton's larger force was still coming, Hitler held back the panzer divisions stationed near Calais for nearly 7 weeks after the Normandy landings, waiting for a second blow that Patton's actual army was never going to deliver from that direction, because Patton's actual army was already forming in England for a very different job entirely. That was the position Patton was in on April 25, 1944, one of the Allies' most closely managed and most valuable reputational assets, and simultaneously, a man still one public mistake away from losing his command entirely, when he agreed to speak at the opening of a British-run welcome club for American servicemen in the small Cheshire town of Knutsford. The event itself was minor by design, a local social club meant to give American GIs somewhere friendly to spend an evening in a country many of them had been stationed in for months without much to do. Organized by British civic volunteers, and opened with a handful of short remarks from local dignitaries and the senior American officer available. It was the kind of assignment that would ordinarily have gone almost unnoticed in the wartime schedule of a lieutenant general, a ribbon-cutting exercise in Allied friendliness with a cup of tea afterward, chosen specifically because it carried none of the visibility of a press conference or a formal military ceremony. Patton was told, and appears to have genuinely believed, that his remarks would not be reported, a private word to a local audience, rather than a press event. He spoke without notes, in the loose, expansive style that had gotten him into trouble before, and at one point, reaching for a line he attributed to George Bernard Shaw about Britain and America being two nations divided by a common language, he added his own extension of the thought. He said it was the evident destiny of the British and the Americans, and, he added, of course the Russians, to rule the world, and that the better the British and Americans came to know each other, the better a job they would do of it together. A reporter was in the room. Patton had not been told to expect one, and by his own later account, genuinely did not realize anyone present was taking the remarks down for publication. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. What happened to that sentence on its way into print made the actual damage considerably worse than the sentence itself. Several of the British newspaper accounts that ran with the story dropped Patton's reference to the Russians entirely, reporting only that he had described it as the destiny of Britain and America to rule the world together, with no mention of the third nation he had actually included in the same breath. By the time anyone moved to correct the record, the story had already crossed the Atlantic in that incomplete form, and American papers picked it up exactly the way the British wire copy had delivered it. It read, to readers who had no way of knowing what Patton had actually said in the room, as a general openly writing the Soviet Union out of the post-war world the Allies were still jointly fighting to win, at a moment when Washington was actively managing a delicate wartime alliance with Moscow that neither the State Department nor the War Department wanted an American general publicly complicating. The whole episode also exposed a gap in how the wartime press system was actually supposed to work. Correspondents covering Allied forces in England operated under a formal accreditation system, with clear rules about which remarks were on the record and which were not, rules Patton had relied on without personally confirming they applied to this particular room on this particular evening. Whether the reporter present that night had simply not been informed the event was meant to be private, or had been informed and judged the remarks too newsworthy to sit on, was never fully settled to anyone's satisfaction. What was clear was that the system built to prevent exactly this kind of leak had failed, once again, around the one general in the European theater who could least afford it to fail. The American reaction moved fast and came from multiple directions at once. A Washington Post editorial concluded that, whatever his merits as a strategist or a tactician, Patton had revealed glaring defects as a leader of men, language aimed less at the speech itself than at a pattern the editorial writers now felt entitled to describe as established. In Congress, Representative Carl Munt of South Dakota offered the line that got quoted more than almost anything else that came out of the episode, that Patton had succeeded in slapping the face of every one of the United Nations except Great Britain. The joke worked precisely because it tied the new controversy directly back to the old one, reminding readers that this was the same general who had put his hands on hospitalized soldiers 9 months earlier, now apparently insulting half of the Allied coalition in the same breath he used to praise the other half. Editorial cartoonists picked up the theme within days. Radio commentators who had covered the slapping story back in November suddenly had a second Patton segment to fill, and several of them explicitly framed Knutsford as proof that the earlier episode had taught him nothing. British commentary, by contrast, tended to treat the whole affair with more amusement than outrage, several papers noting dryly that Patton had at least included their own country in the flattering half of the remark, which did little to calm the reaction coming back across the Atlantic from Washington. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, learned about Patton's remarks the same way most of official Washington did, from the newspapers, rather than through any advance warning from Eisenhower's own headquarters. That alone said something about how little control Eisenhower's staff had managed to exercise over what reached the press out of England that spring, 6 weeks before the largest security operation of the entire war was scheduled to begin. On April 29, 1944, Eisenhower sent Marshall a message, laying out his own assessment of the problem, in strikingly blunt language for a communication between two men who both knew Patton's talent as well as anyone alive. He wrote that Patton seemed unable to use reasonably good sense in any of the matters where a senior commander needed to appreciate how his own actions and statements would land with the public, and that the pattern raised real doubts about the wisdom of keeping him in a position of high command at all. He told Marshall he was deferring any final decision until he heard back from Washington, effectively putting the question of Patton's career in the hands of a man 3,000 miles from the headquarters that would actually have to live with the consequences of the answer. Eisenhower was not a neutral referee in this either. His own position as Supreme Allied Commander rested on a widely held belief, inside the War Department and in the press covering it, that he was the steady hand capable of managing exactly this kind of volatile personality without letting it derail the invasion everyone in the world was now waiting for. A second embarrassing headline out of his own headquarters in the 6 weeks before D-Day would have reflected on his judgment every bit as much as on Patton's temper, and both men understood that going into the exchange of cables that followed. Marshall's reply did not tell Eisenhower what to do. It told him, in careful, deliberate language, exactly what was actually at stake in making that decision either way. He wrote that the effect of the affair on Eisenhower personally, on the troops, and on public confidence in the War Department had to be weighed against an unmistakable fact, that Patton was the only Army commander immediately available who had actual combat experience fighting Rommel's forces in the desert and leading large-scale amphibious landings, followed by a rapid campaign of exploitation once the beachhead was secure. Precisely the skill set the invasion of France was going to require the moment the armies broke out of Normandy. Whether the Army could afford to give up that advantage over a speech, Marshall wrote, was a judgment he was leaving entirely to Eisenhower's own conviction about what Overlord actually needed to succeed. It was, in its own restrained bureaucratic language, as close as Marshall was willing to come to telling Eisenhower directly that the invasion needed Patton more than it needed to be seen punishing him. Eisenhower read that reply for what it plainly was, an argument for keeping Patton dressed up as a neutral summary of the considerations involved, and he made his decision within days. He did not relieve Patton. He wrote him a letter instead, one that combined a formal rebuke with language leaving no ambiguity about how much margin remained. He told Patton plainly that his failure to control his own tongue had once again created exactly the kind of embarrassment senior officers were expected to avoid, and he closed the letter with a warning that has survived as one of the more quoted lines in the entire relationship between the two men. He wrote that he wanted to tell Patton officially and definitely that if he was again guilty of any indiscretion in speech or action that led to embarrassment for the War Department, any other part of the government, or Eisenhower's own headquarters, he would relieve him instantly from command. Instantly. Not after a review, not after a second warning. Eisenhower chose that specific word deliberately, and Patton, reading it, understood exactly how much rope he had left, which by that point, in the spring of 1944, was effectively none. There is no surviving record of Patton ever testing that word again, while Eisenhower remained his direct superior, which by the standards of a man who had already tested it twice in under a year, said as much about the letter's effectiveness as anything Eisenhower could have written in a longer, softer version of the same warning. Patton's own private reaction, recorded in his diary in the days that followed, moved between genuine remorse and a kind of wounded disbelief that a room he had been told was off the record had cost him this much twice in one war. He wrote that he felt his career was likely finished, that the incident, layered on top of the slapping scandal still fresh in the public memory, might be the thing that finally ended it, regardless of what Eisenhower himself wanted. He was, by most accounts of the following weeks, genuinely careful in a way he had rarely managed to be before, aware that Eisenhower's letter had used up the very last reserve of institutional patience available to him. Officers on his own staff later described those weeks as the quietest they ever saw him, a man built almost entirely around blunt, unfiltered talk, suddenly weighing every sentence before he said it out loud. He did not get another chance to test that patience before D-Day. Third Army stayed in England, still not publicly linked to Patton's name in any German intelligence assessment, still doing its part for Fortitude simply by existing quietly, while its commander kept his head down and his remarks, for once, off any reporter's notepad. On June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy went ahead without him. Exactly as planned since before Knutsford had ever happened, Patton's Third Army held back in reserve for the breakout phase that would come once the beachhead was secure. He got his combat command back in August 1944, when Third Army entered France and began the sweeping advance across the French countryside that turned into the fastest and most celebrated campaign of his career. The same qualities Marshall had cited in his telegram to Eisenhower, now finally allowed to do the only thing that had ever actually protected Patton from the consequences of his own mouth: win. The irony of the entire episode is difficult to overstate once it is laid out in full. Patton had stood up in a small English town and declared it the destiny of great nations to jointly decide the shape of the post-war world. And the words cost him, for a period of days that felt considerably longer to the men living through them, the chance to have any hand in deciding anything at all. He was rescued not by the eloquence of his own defense, because he barely offered one beyond a quiet, private apology to Eisenhower, and not by any groundswell of public sympathy, because the public reaction ran hard against him for weeks. He was rescued by a memo from George Marshall that reduced the entire question to a cold calculation about desert warfare experience and amphibious exploitation tactics. The same brutal, transactional logic of total war that had made him useful to the Army in the first place, and that very nearly discarded him twice for the exact personality traits that made him effective on a battlefield. Eisenhower carried the weight of that decision quietly for the rest of the war, never publicly second-guessing it, and never fully letting Patton forget how close it had come, either. The two men's correspondence in the months that followed Knutsford reads like two professionals who both understood exactly what had almost happened, and had simply agreed, without saying so directly, not to discuss it again unless it became necessary. It became necessary once more, 17 months later, in October 1945, when a different set of remarks about denazification policy in occupied Bavaria finally cost Patton the command Eisenhower had fought to preserve for him in the spring of 1944. By then, the war in Europe was over, and the calculation Marshall had made about Rommel and amphibious landings no longer applied to anything. There was no longer a Third Army breakout that needed his specific talents, no invasion still ahead that only he could help win. The same tongue that Eisenhower's April 1944 letter had warned him about got him relieved for good the moment the war stopped needing what came attached to it. Omar Bradley, who had taken the Army Group command Patton lost partly because of the slapping scandal, and who would go on to serve as Patton's nominal superior for most of the campaign in France, wrote about the Knutsford affair years later with the same restrained, unshowy tone he brought to most of his judgments about his more volatile colleague. He did not describe it as a turning point or a lesson learned. He described it as entirely predictable, the kind of thing that happened whenever Patton was given a microphone and no direct military objective to focus his attention on. And he noted, without much apparent surprise, that it would keep happening for exactly that reason until the day someone finally let it end Patton's career for good. The soldiers who served under Patton through the readiness of Third Army in England that spring remembered the tension at headquarters more than the specifics of what he had actually said in Knutsford, because most of them never heard the full quote either, only the version that had already been stripped down to its most damaging half-sentence by the time it reached the ranks. They remembered officers close to Patton going quiet for days, unsure whether they would still be serving under him by the time the invasion came. They remembered the relief when it came, arriving not as an announcement, but simply as the absence of any announcement at all. Patton still there, still training them, the crisis apparently over, without anyone above their level explaining exactly how close it had actually been. They remembered training exercises that continued exactly as scheduled through the whole affair, because whatever was happening between Eisenhower and Marshall in cable traffic never once slowed down the invasion preparations Third Army still had to complete. They remembered Patton himself seeming, in the weeks after, slightly quieter in the way a famously unquiet man could be quieter, choosing his words in briefings with a visible caution that had not been there before. They remembered, months later, watching that same caution disappear completely the moment Third Army finally crossed into France, and Patton had a battlefield in front of him again, instead of a room full of reporters he could not always spot in time. Some of them said afterward that they had never seen a happier man than Patton on the day Third Army finally received its orders to move, as if 6 weeks of forced restraint had been its own kind of combat he was relieved to finally have behind him. They remembered, too, the strange doubled life Patton was living through those same weeks without most of them fully understanding it, touring dummy tank parks in Kent for German reconnaissance cameras one week and touring hospital wards in an apology tour the next, playing the most feared general in the German order of battle and the most closely supervised general in his own army at the exact same time, sometimes within the same handful of days. Soldiers assigned to the dummy camps in Kent later described Patton arriving for these staged tours in full uniform, inspecting empty fields dotted with rubber tanks, with exactly the same theatrical intensity he brought to inspecting real armor, playing a role for cameras he knew German analysts would eventually study frame by frame, then returning to Third Army's actual headquarters to run maneuvers for men who had no idea their commander had spent the morning performing for an audience that was never going to show up in the flesh at all. The men closest to Patton in those weeks understood something the wider public reading Washington Post editorials never had reason to consider, that the general they served under was not simply a gifted battlefield tactician who occasionally embarrassed himself in public. He was, by the spring of 1944, a man whose entire usefulness to the war effort had come to depend on a set of qualities the Army could not fully separate from each other, even when it badly wanted to. The same bluntness that made him inspiring in a briefing tent and reckless in front of a reporter. The same certainty that made him effective driving a tank column across France and dangerous holding a microphone in a room he thought was empty of anyone taking notes. Nobody in Washington or at Eisenhower's headquarters ever found a way to keep one half of that combination and discard the other. They simply gambled, twice, that the war still needed the whole package badly enough to keep absorbing the cost of it. We should not forget how close the men who fought under him came to fighting under someone else entirely, over a sentence about destiny that a British newspaper editor cut in half before anyone in Washington ever had the chance to read it whole. It is worth sitting with how small the actual offense was against how large the consequences nearly became. A toast to Allied unity, delivered off the cuff in a room Patton believed was closed to the press, very nearly cost the United States Army one of the 2 or 3 men it would most need for the campaign still to come, over a sentence a British editor trimmed down for space, and an American editor then ran with exactly as trimmed. Did your father or grandfather serve with 3rd Army in England before D-Day, or anywhere in Patton's command through the rest of the war? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.